You're listening to the Devil Dog Talk Show.
This show contains explicit material and is recommended for ages 18 and older for mature audiences only. But hey, it's the internet.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Devil Dog Talk Show. Today we have Jon Darby, and we're going to be discussing a lot of amazing topics, but one of them is a foundation. And help me remember the name. It's Defense
Intelligence Memorial Foundation.
Defense Intelligence Memorial Foundation.
That's right.
Thank you. And we're going to be covering a lot of different subjects as well, going in depth a little bit about Jon and his history, but mainly hitting the talking point, especially for us in the community, the veteran community, but in the United States. We are going to be discussing a hard to talk about subject. That's the reason why I'm kind of flubbing up the words here. Suicide. All right. It's a difficult subject, but at the end of the day, there's resources, there's communication, and there's availability. And when me and Jon kind of had our discovery call, I was just absolutely inspired to make today happen. And even with the signal problems we've been having here where I live, we're going to make it happen today. So Jon, thank you first and foremost for being on. It's a great time to share with you today some of your experiences and your history. Thank you for being on.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
No problem. Now, to get right into it, Jon, you're not a typical veteran in the sense of the word, but to me, there's this really large sense of service that you can tell by your backdrop, right? You got an eagle shadow that just really looks remarkable right now on screen. Well, how did you get into, I would say, service, so to speak? How did you get involved in the government?
Well, I guess it kind of started. My dad was a federal government employee out in Montana, worked for Department of Interior. So I always had that sense of, seeing a public servant as a good career in my dad. And then went to college and got, majored in international relations and knew I wanted to do something having to do with overseas work. And then moved out to DC. Got a job down on Capitol Hill for a few months and then got hired by NSA as a Russian linguist, the National Security Agency. So that's where I started many years ago and had, spent the next 39 plus years in the U.S. intelligence community, the majority of that time with the National Security Agency, but worked side by side with, colleagues from every branch of the service. Deployed downrange multiple times, really as National Security Agency is what they call a combat support agency. So where there are people in uniform in harm's way, there's, NSA is there, with them and helping support them and provide the right kind of intelligence to help them carry out their mission and protect them while they're doing so. That's
amazing. That's something that I think isn't discussed at length or really recognized is the sense of service within these different departments and all government agencies, right? The Department of Interior, I genuinely couldn't tell you what that does or is. And then to get into it, of course, the NSA, which everybody has their theories, right? There's these stories of, cyber spooks or whatever they are called, or what the technical term would be. But there's this amazing sense of service that when we were discussing, it really hit home with me because you glossed over a tremendous amount of work history, right? Working with the NSA, getting into the government, and some of the type of things that we kind of approached, on our phone call, it just struck me so hard. So I kind of want to bring up, how did you get involved in the sense of developing in the NSA? What was the NSA like in your early years, and how did that kind of build to where it was when you retired, so to speak?
Yeah, I saw a lot of change, since when I hired on in late 1983 with NSA. And, I tell some people ask me toward the end of my career why I stayed at NSA for such a long time. And it really came down to three things: is that being part of something bigger than myself that was making such a difference was pretty awesome. And I was lucky over the years to be in different jobs and saw the direct impact of the intel that we provided, made a difference to the United States and our allies. That's number one. Number two is the intellectual challenge of working there. Because you think about it, NSA is a technical organization. You've got to be world class in all kinds of, not just technology, but legal issues and global affairs issues, and foreign language and computer science and data science and engineering and all that stuff. And it's a global enterprise. And it's around the world. And I learned something new every single day at NSA. And the third thing gets back to the sense of service is the people that work there. They're just amazing people, brilliant, dedicated, there to do the right thing. Could work in many other places and make a lot more money, but choose to stay where they are to make that direct impact for the nation. So that's anyway. I don't know if I may have strayed away a bit away from your original question, but that's really the the sense of why I stayed at NSA for so long. And it's kind of a funny story I tell is at the time I mentioned I was down and working on Capitol Hill, the job offer from NSA, and I left the Hill job for two reasons. One, I was going to get paid a little bit more down on at NSA. Down on Capitol Hill at the time, I was making $15,000 a year, and NSA was going to pay me $16,500 a year. So I said, all right, another $100 a month, you bet, I'll do that. And the second thing is I thought it would be kind of cool working at NSA. And, fast forward nearly 40 years, and I was making a lot more than $16,500 a year. But it was also not just way cool. It was really freaking cool, the stuff that we got to do at NSA across the board. So anyway, that's, why I stayed there for so long.
That's amazing. It really is. It's amazing to hear because I know in a lot of different programs, agencies and stuff like that, there is a sense of being cool, right? Like doing the odd work that people don't really discuss at length because it's just different, right? For you to see the NSA develop, of course, from the 80s, 90s, 2000, early 2000s, 10s, and then now into the 20s, right? Reflecting back on it, that's a tremendous amount of work, 40 plus years of, being involved and discerning kind of the traffic, the signal to noise ratio and kind of bringing it into focus for our leadership to really take action in ways that most people don't understand or speak about. When you were a young man, right, working in the government, how did you continue, I guess, to have that outlook like this was your sense of purpose? This is giving you that drive.
Yeah, let me back up a little bit kind of to your original question about
Good.
what's changed over the years across at NSA. And I think it's reflective across the entire intelligence community. When I started in 83, NSA was very stovepiped, just like, rest of the intelligence agencies. I remember my first job. I frankly really didn't like my first job at NSA. My job was to sit down, put on some headphones, translate some Russian, and I couldn't ask where it came from. I couldn't ask what happened next. And God forbid anybody talks to any other people from another agency. You just don't do that. So this is really not my thing. I don't want to do that. So that I wound up getting another job and had an opportunity to go overseas and work with multiple different agencies and helped groom my outlook that I carried for the next, 35 plus years. Is it doesn't matter who's paying your paycheck. We're all on the same side, Team USA. So it doesn't matter if you're with FBI, NSA, DIA, any other government agency, we're all part of the same team. So, and that's that working together mindset drove me from then on. And that really didn't take off across the intelligence community until after 9/11, when there was a recognition that, look, we all need to work more together and really operate as a community instead of, however many different intelligence agencies doing their own thing. So we really, developed into a community from 9/11 on. So, and the priorities obviously changed over the years as well. When I hired on, it was all about the Soviet Union, the big bear, and get after them. The wall fell down in 89, and then it was, a shift in priorities that there was, peace breaking out, no more Cold War. And then, lo and behold, 9/11 happened, and counterterrorism was at the top of the heap. And I actually got reassigned in the wake of 9/11, along with many other people, to work counterterrorism, where I spent the better part of the next, 12 years working counterterrorism. And then, go back over the last, 6-7 years or so, it shifted over to China being the top priority. So China is still an overwhelming priority. It's not a new Cold War, but it's a big, hard problem. And then, now you've got, the priority shifting, more focus on border security than in the past too.
Now that's an important differentiation, because when you look at the differences between how we apply what it is we're doing, especially on our side of the military style, military house, it's just really awesome that you can kind of say that, you've seen so many different shifts of prioritization and focuses, and of course different administrations, but being able to still have that sense of service and unification, where you're like, hey, we're all same team, right? I think the hockey team really helped us all, reunite after their whole big win recently, where it's just Team USA. I think that's amazing.
It's funny you bring that up about the hockey. I actually use the Miracle on Ice story a lot, when I talk to leadership courses and so on, and point to a scene in the movie Miracle that was about that 1980 hockey team. And anyway, I won't get into the whole background, but a really touching scene. At one point, their coach says, you all are not going to words to the effect, you're not going to be everything you can be until you start playing for the name on the front of your jersey and not the one on the back. So that's why I would tell people, look, you're part of the IC, you're playing for Team USA. Don't tell me you work for NSA or CIA or FBI or Army or what. We're all the same team. So, and another thing, when we talk about, my career at NSA was really, 95% plus focused on the signals intelligence mission, which is what that means is intercept of foreign electronic communications, whether it's email, phone conversations, radar, missiles, telemetry and the like, and produce intelligence for policymakers, military commanders. But, and anybody who heard me at NSA probably heard me say this, I don't even know how many times, is we were not in the business to produce libraries. We were in the business of supporting and driving operations. Intel without actually being able to act on it is worthless. So that's why we developed these close partnerships with, special forces, with the Bureau, with the State Department, those that actually had the authorities to act on behalf of the United States government, informed by the intel that we could provide to help them.
See, that's the biggest thing that I always remembered, especially from my time in service, was the route of communication, right? If you can't use what you know, or if you can't adapt to what it is you need to be doing, you're really just, sadly enough, sending people, home in a coffin. A lot more times than not, especially in 2006, where people could identify, we knew certain routes were already established no-goes, right? And people would be like, no, we're going to go. And it's like, all right, I guess, the STP and the FRIS is going to be working today. And sure as shit, more often than not, it would happen, right? It would hit the fan, and here you go. You're just doing stuff. But I find that amazing that you're able to say, hey, if we can't take action, we're not a library. I love that, because the same thing in any construct or any concept of life, if you're not applying what it is, if you're not leveraging your wisdom, then it's just kind of fruitless knowledge. There's not any movement on that. No.
Yeah, I will say there are exceptions that in some cases you want to do long-term intelligence analysis to help inform like weapons countermeasures for so on. For example, provide intel on research methods, approach, and so on that an adversary is doing to develop a weapon. But again, it's driving the operation to develop that that countermeasure for the weapon. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely.
So it's not necessarily driving an operation tomorrow. It could drive an operation, years in the future, but it's always with an end toward. That's why we do this.
That's amazing, because that's kind of the stuff that a lot of guys that I talk to don't think about. It's very much a, I don't want to say emotional reactions, but yeah, after 9/11, there was a lot of emotions, of course. And our tactics kind of reflected that in a lot of different ways. And, coming off of, I would say it was right around '06, that's when you started seeing just more and more and more IEDs, VBIEDs, directional blast wave stuff, or whatever they call penetrating, just nasty business, right? Scientifically amazing stuff, but nasty business. How was that at that point in time, now moving forward to where you're at, taking the whole kind of purview into kind of construct here? What have you seen, I want to say, in the benefit of how we apply intelligence in today's arena?
Well, I really think what we did as an intelligence community in counterterrorism paved the way for a lot, down the road in other areas. I mean, really, counterterrorism is a mission that was about, finding terrorists and stopping them before they do anything. It's an outcome focused intel game. You're supporting the military, you're supporting FBI, you're supporting foreign law enforcement and so on to actually take folks off the street. Now, let's look at Russia and China, for example. It's a different kind of intelligence, or a different kind of adversary of the United States from a national security perspective. And you're not trying to take people off the street. You're trying to disrupt or counter what they may be trying to do, whether it's in, cognitive warfare, whether it's military development, you name it. And I actually think we saw the results of some of that counterterrorism experience play out in the lead up to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. I mean, you saw what was publicly out there was intel, about there was intel publicly released about here's what we knew, what Russia was doing. And you never really saw that at that scale before. It is essentially geopolitical information warfare, where information was being put out for months ahead of time saying, here's what the Russians are planning to do. Here's how they're going to do it. Here's how they're planning to carry out a false flag operation to make it look like the Ukrainians instigated this. A lot of that was driven by the same folks that work counterterrorism for years, with an eye toward how do you take intel and, shape it in such a way that it actually can inform a U.S. national intended objective. Does that make sense?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. And it's actually, I think, very relevant to the word intelligence, right?
Yep. Yeah. Yep.
See, I have a lot of questions, right? Of course, I'd like to ask certain questions, but I won't want to put you in any boxes where we can't paint ourselves out of here. When Ukraine and Russia kind of kicked off, and it seemed to be more of along the lines of an open source information, right? There was just so many lines and traffic and trends, and nowadays you can see it on Instagram, you could see it on X, just maybe not exactly live feeds, but pretty damn relevant. I was having a conversation with the gentleman about drone warfare, and of course internet and the different optical tactics, and everybody's doing this different stuff. Do you see the application of, I want to say, kind of that GWA era or counterterrorism era, electronic warfare, where we were suppressing, certain signals so we can drive through certain areas because they're jamming phones or whatnot? Do you see that becoming more and more relevant in today's type of warfare, or is it kind of switching majorly to like the cognitive stuff?
Sure. I mean, it's been relevant for a long time. Jamming signals and, electronic warfare has been part of the game all along. It's the key is how do you integrate that with kinetic operations and plans and so on. You've heard, and I have no inside classified information about this, but, you look at the Maduro operation, from everything I've heard is, things were shut down, to allow the military to go in and do their, operations. The Venezuelan air defenses were down and the like, and that was, an electronic warfare type, operation that was put into place to as I understand it, to help the U.S. carry out their operation.
See, that's amazing. Since that whole thing kicked off, and more recently, just I believe it was yesterday or the day before, with the Mexican thing that's going on in there, Mexico, there seems to be a lot of movement in operational tempo. I want to say, at least from the way I'm looking at things, right? I'm like, hey, what do you mean? 10 days ago, we had a whole, intervention of what do we call it? Cross training. And I worked out, and in '06 we did a MIC and PIC teams where we were doing cross training and training medical teams and how to do certain things and operate within the realms of what the arena was there, the area of operations. Do you see it a little bit more important then to kind of really hit home as far as building up our technologies to work on it? Because I did see a lot of the cartel members posting, anti-aerial weaponry, like literal, like stingers type of stuff. And then on top of it, they have anti-drone guns that aren't even, well, they're there in Ukraine, but they're just really hard to get a hold of. Do you see something that would be better off of like direct communication of what I should say the expectancy after all these different movements, the Maduro thing, the Mexico thing? Do you feel like we're kind of culminating to a bigger action, or do you think these are just isolated events, not necessarily pushing our nation into something?
I don't necessarily see them as part of any kind of master plan, pushing us in some geopolitical direction. I do see that, we're seeing technology being used in different and innovative ways. And the way I've actually talked to folks that have been over in Ukraine and said Ukraine is a live lab for tomorrow's technology. They're being very innovative and using technology in new and different ways and in inexpensive ways. And this was actually something years ago when we first saw drones being used more effectively by our adversaries in the Middle East. And we were using, multi-million-dollar missiles to shoot down a, $2,000 drone, and there has to be a better way to do that.
Yeah, that's what actually we were, one of the guests, James, we were talking about that very thing. The interventions don't make sense anymore because, like you said, a couple $100,000 missile system being wasted on now probably a couple $100 drone system,
Yep.
right?
Yep.
That is it just always shakes my, I guess, rattles my brain, to ask these certain questions about especially signals and, the way data works, because it just really impressed me when you said that about the whole, we're not a library. We're not just trying to build up things. And Ukraine is really becoming that active lab of what is and is not working. Do you see not necessarily this administration, because you've worked through other administrations, do you see a relevant line of foresight within our leadership or representation where they're accounting for these type of situations?
Well, I think there's a recognition across all administrations, the importance of technology. Certainly, we're seeing an emphasis in the current administration to deliver new technologies faster and more agilely. I mean, the whole defense acquisition bureaucracy is just, unwieldy and has been for 50 years. And people have been saying we need to change it. And we've been ineffective at doing that. But I'm seeing a lot more focus and priority by this administration to actually do so. So we'll see how it plays out. But it's,
Awesome.
for instance, it's difficult for startups with new technology to get into the intelligence community, for example. That's because of all the rules and processes that were set up for a system that was designed to build battleships and not, drones.
That is so true, right? A lot of the oversight and the process, I'm not too familiar with it, right? I was just a simple guy in the Navy, didn't have to do all the screening like a lot of other people I know. But I always find it really important, like what you're saying, innovation, development, relationships, building these lines of conversations where people are like, hey, we've noticed optical cables, right? It seems relevant, right? These drones that they can go. Other things are where we're seeing observation and movement. And I don't like thinking that our whole mechanical warfare, tanks and larger mechanized things, right? Like amphibious assault vehicles, where they're really irrelevant on a field where people are dropping, tank killers from a $100, $200 drone. And I've noticed that in the space of, of course, podcasting and social media and discussing things with veterans, that there seems to be not just an overwhelming concern of the overlap, right, with the issues that we're seeing in Ukraine, but also the application that we're seeing along the border. Do you feel as though we're giving, as a nation, right? This is just an opinion-based thing, that we're giving those type of concerns enough attention, and are we funding them adequately?
If I get your question, I would say no, we're not funding the asymmetric capabilities appropriately. I mean, and I use, for example, I think you can use the same amount of money that you apply to build one more aircraft to cyber, for example, and the cyber capabilities will ultimately be a lot more effective than one more aircraft. So, but this is it's a culture that's been built up over 50 years about producing hardware, and in fact, some cases hardware, more agile, technology would be more effective.
See, that's really to me, because I sit up late at night going, hey, are we? Because of course, being a veteran, I know that we're not, right. I know we're not. It's like, are we spending the money the right way? Are we looking to the future of, what's possible? And everything that I think about, my friends and I talk about over a few beers, it seems to be more or less like, hey, I don't think we're ready for that next evolution of warfare. And I think Ukraine really kind of proved that, as far as large scale operations, trench warfare, reintroducing, simple methods. Like we were talking, NSA, the whole signals intelligence. It was, counter pigeons back in the way day. Well, that's so funny. Now, bringing up certain things about the NSA, right? Your work within the NSA was clearly something that affected your life. You stayed for a very long time. Where did you find yourself, let's say, after when you were integrating out of the NSA? How did you then get some kind of redirection and find a sense of purpose?
So, yeah, my story is kind of interesting. When I left NSA, I originally retired from NSA in late 2017. And my intent at that job was to get a job somewhere in the defense sector than private industry, because I'd never really worked in private industry and I wanted to learn more how that side of the business worked. Well, I'd been out for a few months, and then I got a call from the new director of NSA, General Nakasone, and he asked me to come back and be his director of operations at NSA. So, that was offer I couldn't turn down. So I went back into government and served as his director of operations, basically responsible for all SIGINT on all topics worldwide, and did that for like 4.5 years or so. And then retired again in late summer of 2022. And at that point, I didn't want to work full time. Figured I wanted to, maybe consult and help some companies here and there. And I did that for about a year or so. And somebody asked me about a year after I'd retired, am I finding this fulfilling, what I'm doing? I said, I thought about it and said, well, I'm learning a lot, about how private industry works and the drivers and the vocabulary and all that kind of stuff that I wish I would have known when I was in government, because I think that could have made me more effective when I was in government. But the human side is what I was missing. Now, inside NSA, I was, leading, teams of small teams, thousands of people teams, and really, mentoring folks and really heavily involved in the leadership side of things. I didn't really have that going on the outside. And as, just as luck would have it, about a month after I had that conversation, somebody approached me about being part of this foundation that I'd never heard of. It was the Defense Intelligence Memorial Foundation, a foundation that was formed just a few years earlier, whose mission was to provide post-secondary education costs to the children of fallen employees of the Defense Intelligence Enterprise. Now, Defense Intelligence Enterprise, that's a mouthful for a lot of people. What all does that mean? It does not mean CIA, because CIA is not part of the Department of Defense or War. It's those intelligence agencies that are part of the department, like NSA, DI, Defense Intelligence Agency, National Geospatial Intelligence Agency, NGA, the National Reconnaissance Agency, NRO, the Service Intelligence Centers, the combatant commands, and so on. So there's a whole world of intelligence folks within the Department of now War. And this foundation was set up for that. And it was established in the wake of a suicide attack that took place in 2019 that I was well aware of as the Director of Operations, because we lost one of our best employees in that attack in Syria. It killed, among others, Senior Chief Petty Officer Shannon Kent of the Navy, who worked for NSA, and Scotty Wirtz, a civilian who worked for DIA. And some DIA employees said, we want to do something to honor Scotty. So they set up this foundation in 2019. It was effectively a startup for a few years. So when I signed on and joined up as a volunteer for the foundation to serve as their chairman of the board in 2024, we're scaling it up and make it more sustainable and scalable at this point.
That's amazing, right? Because when you bring that up, right, I'm pretty familiar with that attack. These are people that have served and sacrificed, whether it be in a different capacity, but literally along the lines and with other veterans like the Navy, the Chief Petty Officer there, a Senior Chief. When you look at the opportunities to do something for their families that have been left behind, I don't see why it isn't as much discussed about, right? When Don Myricks brought up the whole Defense Intelligence Memorial Foundation, I've never heard of it. I've been in the nonprofit space. I've been in the veteran space for now 15, going on 16 years. Again, you said it was started up just 4 or 5 years ago, but I go, just not knowing it, I think, is half the battle. The awareness of these organizations, and then the reasons why. I always find that to be the most important, right? Because we have a lot of organizations right now that, to me, are sponging up a lot of funds, a lot of donations, and a lot of things that could be going to better uses, better conversations, better implementations, better, I don't want to say intentions, but definitely better outcomes. Learning about that whole secondary school approach, right? We're not just setting up the kids up for the future. We're setting them up for that and beyond, right? We're aiming for generational education and wealth in a way where, when you lose somebody to warfare, or if you lose somebody at all, right? Whether it be to enemy actions, or sadly enough, when a lot of veterans come home, to suicide. That's something else that we and you really had a resonant conversation about, and to kind of focus it back onto the organization though. What is the goals of the organization this year? How do we support the DIMF whole?
So you hit on a big driver that we have is spread the awareness of the foundation. I mean, I'll tell you frankly, when I say I'd never heard of it, and when I became part of it, I talked to people across the community. I get out and about and lots of different gatherings and industry and government and so on. And when I bring up DIMF, I get a lot of blank looks, like, "Huh? I don't know anything about that. That sounds interesting." So I definitely don't get that as much anymore. I kind of get the glint of recognition. Go, yeah, I've heard about this. And so we're getting there. We're spreading that awareness, slowly but surely. We have partnerships with other foundations that have similar but not exact missions. For example, the Special Operations Warrior Foundation, SOWF. We split costs for one student because his father that was killed was on a Special Forces mission, as an intel guy. That's one of the things a lot of people tend to forget. They think of the intel weenies as the ones sitting in the back shop, manipulating the mouses, the mice and the data and so on. But you've got a lot of those intel weenies that are outside the wire, the ones, translating enemy communications and pointing out there's an ambush over the hill and things like that. And many of them are as at a high, as just as high risk as many of the shooters that are out there. So, but anyway, the point being, we're a niche foundation. It's not big, but we fill a niche that others don't fill. And what's different about our foundation, aside from being relatively small, is we will pay for any type of post-secondary education. It doesn't have to be undergraduate. It can be graduate school. It can be med school. It can be law school. It can be trade school. Anything that's accredited. We want to, give that kid, the student, the opportunity to get trained in that area. We're actually at a point right now, from a resource perspective, we can pay for spouses now, surviving spouses, because many times those, particularly military, young military folks, the spouses give up a career to move somewhere with their spouse, and all of a sudden the spouse is gone and they're stuck. What now? Well, we want to be able to provide that helping hand to, hey, you don't have to worry about a cost if you want to go back to school. And down the road, we aspire to provide mental health support for the surviving families. We're working through the details of that right now. We don't have the resource base to do that quite yet, but that's what we're shooting for down the road.
That's powerful, because it's a full-time job being, that support system for our service members, including, our intelligence personnel. In fact, just everybody involved in the government. There's a workload that is illy communicated. I believe that as a nation, of course, we're a little bit blissfully ignorant of that. But bringing it up to the forefront, talking about these gentlemen, although they may be intel weenies, right? A little pale from never getting outside, right? Hey, it's okay. The SEAL guys have their gel, slick back hair, and everybody's having a good time with their suntans, all right? I'm just saying that bringing it to the foreground of the conversation to say, look, we're in this team together. A lot of us don't like talking about those dark moments where we lose people, but somebody has to carry that torch forward for those family members, right? And to really show up. I think that's the easiest thing to say, is to show up, right? I think it's amazing that you guys are aiming towards mental health, because mental health has been a journey of mine for 15, 16 years now. To be truthfully honest, when I got back in 2006, I did check in and got a bunch of things squared away and understood. But of course, things, you put them in different compartments and they come back in different ways. You're like, hey, wait a minute, why are you getting big? I thought I put you away, right? No. And when you do that, when you focus on the mental health of the family, if you focus on the mental health of the ones left behind, because there is no bringing those people back, but there is living within their memories, living within them, right? Bringing that forward. And I always find it interesting to talk about education. Kids that never got to see their parents, get to know their parents. One of the service members that passed away, Zachary M. Elday, when I was deployed, he had a young girl, I want to say a few months old, right? It sits with you. They never get to know this person that sacrificed so much for them to be there, let alone for us to be here, talking about this amazing program and amazing ways to get involved, and, the sense of direction, but more so the sense of belonging, that lifelong love that is poorly communicated, I feel, in both the veteran community and in the civilian community. The sacrifice.
Anything we can do to support those folks,
Yeah.
And it's not just in the immediate aftermath of the loss, but, it can be a triggering event 10, 20 years down the road, for a child heading off to college, for example.
Exactly.
And this actually brings together, it's kind of near and dear to me, the mental health and suicide, mental health support with DIMF, because my personal history with suicide, which I've been a pretty passionate advocate for suicide awareness and prevention for a number of years. And I'll just share my own personal story in that regard. In 1997, I lost my youngest brother to suicide, just right out of the blue. He was 23 years old, just graduated from college, had no idea that anything was at issue with him. And at the time, nobody really talked about suicide. I never hid it. When somebody say, yeah, my brother died, he killed himself. And then I kept hearing, oh, well, my uncle did, or my grandpa did, or whatever. It's like, wow, there's a lot more than I thought out there. So fast forward, in about 2006, when I met I was on a date with my wife, my current wife, and I learned, I shared that my brother had died by suicide. Her older brother had died by suicide at age 48. So, we had that connection there. So we got married. And then in 2011, her older sister killed herself. So, a combination of, bullying at work, and her brother had relationship issues. And it's like, wow. So her two siblings, my youngest brother, and less than a year later, my other brother killed himself in 2012. So he'd just gone through a divorce. He was having some issues at work and so on. And so anyway, we had between my wife and I, we lost 4 siblings to suicide, all different circumstances, all different cases, but still, each one of those individuals had gotten to a point where they thought that was the way out, and my brother left behind 2 young kids, I think maybe 15 and 11 at the time or something like that. So after my wife's sister had died, we were actually meeting with the coroner. We were the ones that, took care of all our affairs, and we were meeting with the coroner and telling her our story. And she said, well, have you thought about talking to people about this? And I said, I hadn't really thought about that, but yeah, maybe we could help other folks. So since that time, I used my platform at NSA where I could reach, thousands of people, and talked a lot about, suicide and mental health awareness and looking out for each other. And yeah, there are lots of, mental health professionals that are good. But personally, I feel the first line of defense for mental health are the people you see every day. Those that, know what's normal. If something looks a little off, ask somebody if they're okay. And they may say, I'm fine, and blow you off, but ask again. As I know from experience over those years that sometimes people, they just want somebody to listen to them, to hear that, and recognize, yeah, there's an issue, and they can talk with them. So it does make a difference. We just need to spend the time, each of us, an army of, all of us are part of an army to support each other. That's, frankly, I think that's why we're all on this world together, to look out for and take care of each other. So, take the extra step to do that. And it takes courage to do that too, because you can feel kind of stupid, if you say, are you okay? And, well, you're really kind of going out there to do that. But, I just think that's a price you need to pay.
That's a great point to be made, right? It's uncomfortable to discuss these things. It's uncomfortable to put yourself out there. It's uncomfortable to have these assumptions. Like, who wants to think, oh, no, they're fine. But that's a part of the American culture. That is a part of our culture. Sadly enough, human culture. We're not isolative in understanding suicide. I do believe it's one of the worst situations or pandemics. It's catastrophic, really, when you look at it as a whole, that we live in an era where we could hop on and communicate about anything with anyone, anywhere, at any point in time. And it could mean the difference between life and death for certain people. And I've been there before. Where the only thing you have left is like the why. Why am I even here? Or you find the answer and it's all on the burden, and it would be better off of ... But the reality of it is, it's not. It's this transference of pain, of misery, and misunderstanding, confusion. And I really do believe in that discussing, about your siblings, about your experience, but more so about the solutions of communication. Put yourself out there. Be a little weird. Be awkward. Look, I'd much rather feel awkward than feel sad about not doing something. That's something that I've believed in for years now. This is the reason why, talking on the show about not just suicide prevention, but actual tangible resources. The crisis line is great for your once in a while type of situations. But if you have prolonged suicidality, you got to get to the core of the issue. Right. Yeah. And if it's depression, work out the depression. If it's anger, work out the anger. If it's work, you bring up work, relationships. It's one of the worst things, both. Right. You could fall down a hole and never get yourself out of it. But with community, with brothers and sisters other than the ones that, sadly have passed away. When we look at that, there's an opportunity to discuss the opportunities, to focus on the good things, to focus on what is bringing life, not just death, and have something to look forward to. I think that's one of the bigger things that we kind of hit on during our phone call the other day was, building out this foundation that focuses on that long-term legacy of others, focusing on the mental health of the community in a way where we're communicating to each other, not in just a way of where life is bad, but in a way where we can say we have a sense of direction, right? So to kind of wrap it up, I really want to have you back on again and again and again and again, and we could talk about both the DIMF and more about your history, and of course the suicide prevention techniques and a lot of things that my wife and I have developed, you and your family have developed, discussing these things. How do we keep in touch, and how can we support a DIMF?
Go to the web, Defense Intelligence Memorial Foundation. We've got a website. You can check it out, see what's there. We have events, fundraising events. And there's one coming up on May 27th in Bethesda, Maryland. A lot of former directors and current and former defense intelligence leaders will be there, as well as industry representatives. So that's really just spread the word about the foundation and let it be known that it's out there.